I woke up to white. Not the white of the mansion walls, or the white of the corridor light, or the white of the silk sheets I had been sleeping in for months. A different white. The specific white of a place that has been scrubbed clean of everything except its function. The white of somewhere you go when the body has said enough and the mind has not been given a vote. I lay still for a moment before I opened my eyes fully. An old habit. Wake up, assess, then move. Never the other way around. Legos taught me that before I was old enough to understand why I was learning it. The ceiling above me was hospital ceiling. The light above me was hospital light. The smell around me was hospital smell. The particular combination of antiseptic and recycled air and the specific quality of quiet that exists in places where people are waiting to find out what comes next. I turned my head. J1 was in the chair beside the bed. Not asleep. He had not been asleep. I could tell from the quality of his stillness that he had been sitting in that chair watching me breathe for however long. I had been unconscious and had not closed his eyes once. His dark suit jacket was gone, his shirt slightly less than its usual perfect, his hair the only thing still impeccable, because some things apparently survived everything. His elbows were on his knees, and his hands were loosely clasped, and his eyes were on my face, and when my eyes found his, he straightened slowly in the chair. He said nothing. I said nothing. We looked at each other for a moment in the white hospital quiet. Then the door opened, and the doctor came in. She was a woman of composed professional efficiency, the kind of doctor who has delivered difficult information enough times that she has developed a specific vocabulary for it, a way of arranging words that is honest and warm and precise all at once. She checked the monitors beside my bed and looked at her notes, and then she looked at me. She said, "How are you feeling?" I said, "Tell me what happened." She said, "You fainted. You were brought in by your maid, who called immediately. You have been here for approximately 3 hours." I said, and she paused, the specific pause of someone arranging the next piece. She said, "We ran a full panel of tests while you were unconscious. Everything came back normal except for one result." I waited. She looked at me, and then she looked at J1, and then she looked back at me, and she said it. The word landed in the white hospital room the way significant words always land, without drama, without announcement, simply arriving and immediately beginning to reorganize everything around them. I was pregnant. The room was very quiet after she said it. I did not look at J1 immediately. I looked at the ceiling, the white hospital ceiling that had nothing to say about any of this and was under no obligation to. I had known. Some part of me had known since that afternoon in the bedroom with my head on his chest, had been knowing and not examining and filing and not opening the file. And now the file was open and the word was in the room, and the ceiling had nothing to offer, and the doctor was still talking, and I heard her voice as something slightly separate from where I was, slightly to the left of the present moment. She finished speaking. She said something about schedule and vitamins and rest. She said she would give us a moment. She left. The door closed. The room was very quiet. I looked at J1. He was already looking at me. He had been looking at me since before she finished speaking. The expression on his face was not one I had seen before. Not the composed authority, not the small, real smile, not the open, unguarded warmth of the balcony. Something else. Something that did not have a name yet because it was too new to have been named. He reached across the space between the chair and the bed, and he took my hand. Not dramatically, not with any of the weight of the moment performed in the gesture. Just took my hand the way you take something you have decided belongs to you, and you're not going to pretend otherwise. I looked at our hands. He said quietly, "Are you all right?" I said, "I do not know yet." He said, "That is all right." And we sat like that in the white hospital room with my hand in his, and the words still in the air between us, and Seoul continuing outside the window, indifferent and vast and ongoing. And I thought about Emeka, because I always thought about Emeka, the compass in my chest pointing its unchanging direction. But this time the thought was different. This time it arrived not as the grief I had been carrying since Lagos, but as something warmer and more complicated. Emeka would have been an uncle. Would have been the kind of uncle who arrived with too many gifts and too many opinions and not enough warning, and filled every room he entered with the specific energy of someone who genuinely loved being alive. I pressed my eyes closed briefly. Then I opened them and looked at the window and the Seoul morning beyond it and felt Jungwon's hand around mine and let the word be real. Pregnant. All right then. They kept me for another 2 hours. Tests, monitoring, the practical machinery of medical care doing what it does. By the time they released me, the morning was fully committed to itself, and the city outside was in the middle of its ordinary day with no awareness of or interest in the extraordinary thing that had just been said in a white room on one of its upper floors. Jae-won brought the car himself, not the driver. Him. We sat in the back, and the city moved past the tinted windows, and neither of us spoke for a while. The silence between us was not the silence of avoidance. It was the silence of two people who are sitting inside something new and large and are giving it the space it requires before they try to put words around it. He spoke first. He said, "I need to know how you're feeling about this." Not the diplomatic version, the real one. I looked at him. I said, "I am afraid." He said, "Of what specifically?" I said, "Of everything specifically. Of what this means for the mission I came here with. Of what this means for the danger we are already inside. Of what it means to bring a child into a household that has spent the past months being shot at and poisoned and infiltrated from inside." He listened to all of this without interrupting. Then he said, "And beyond the fear." I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "Beyond the fear, I feel something I do not have a clean word for. Something that arrived the moment she said it and has not left since. Something that is bigger than the fear, even though the fear is very large." He looked at me for a long moment. He said, "I know that feeling." I said, "Do you?" He said, "I've been feeling it since you ran toward me in the entrance hall." I looked at him. He looked at me. The city moved past the windows, and the morning continued, and we sat inside, the particular warmth of two people who have just said true things to each other and are living in the aftermath of that honesty. Then his phone rang, and the day began. The invitation had come 3 weeks earlier. A formal public gathering of the kind the Park clan attended regularly as part of the careful performance of their public identity. Charitable donations publicly presented. A community investment announced. The particular theater of powerful people demonstrating their benevolence in front of an audience that wanted to believe in it. Jae-won had been scheduled to attend with the father. But that morning, the morning of our return from the hospital, the morning with the words still new in both our mouths, the heir was called to an urgent meeting that could not be moved. The father came to find me. He stood in the doorway of the sitting room where I was resting on the doctor's instructions, and he looked at me with the calculating assessment he brought to everything, and he said, "The occasion is tonight. My son cannot attend. I would like you to accompany me." I looked at him. He looked at me. The invitation was not entirely what it appeared to be. I knew this the way I knew most things in that house. Not because it was stated, but because the father did not do things for single reasons. There was always a layer beneath the surface reason, always a calculation underneath the gesture. But I also knew that declining was not the right move. Not tonight, not with everything that was in motion. I said, "I will be ready at 7. He looked at me for a moment longer than the acceptance required. Then he inclined his head slightly and left. I sat with what had just been agreed to and organized my thoughts carefully and systematically the way I organized everything. Then I went to find Minji to tell her what the evening was going to require. The occasion was exactly what it presented itself as on the surface. Grand, formal, the particular theater of Seoul's powerful performing their public faces for an audience that had spent considerable money to be in the same room with them. The father was impeccable in his element. The warm smile, the measured generosity, the handshakes, and the quiet authoritative words that made every person on the receiving end feel as if they had been specifically seen. I watched him work the room, and I thought, this is what dangerous looks like when it has dressed itself in warmth. This is what my brother did not know to look for. I performed my own version of the evening, the composed, elegant wife of the air, present and gracious, and saying the appropriate things in the appropriate registers. The role I have been playing since the beginning. We were good at performing. Both of us. The father glanced at me once across the room during the dinner, and something moved in his expression, something that was not the public warmth but the real assessment. The layer beneath. I held his gaze steadily and lifted my glass. He almost smiled. After the formal portion of the evening ended, the father found me near the exit of the main hall and said quietly, "There is a garden I would like to show you." Cool me. Not a request. I followed him. We moved through the hotel's interior, away from the main event spaces, away from the crowd and the noise and the performance of the evening, and through a pair of glass doors that opened onto a private garden at the rear of the property. Old trees, stone paths, the particular quality of space that had been tended for a very long time by people who understood that some things needed to be maintained quietly and away from public view. He had been here before. Many times, I could tell. He moved through the garden with the ease of someone walking through a space they knew with their body rather than their eyes. This was not a place he had chosen tonight for its geography. It was a place he had chosen because it was his. There was a small stone table with 2 chairs arranged beside it. He sat in one. I sat in the other. And between the moment I sat down and the moment I had fully settled my weight into the chair, I saw it, the gun, placed on the table with a casualness that was entirely deliberate. Not hidden, not displayed. Simply there. The way you leave something out when you want someone to decide what to do with it. I noted it, filed it, and looked at the father across the table as if I had not seen it at all. He looked back at me with the expression he wore when he was not performing anything. He said, "It is a beautiful night." I said, "It is." And the conversation that followed was not the conversation of a father-in-law and a daughter-in-law sitting in a private garden after a formal occasion. It was something else entirely. Something that had been building since the first day I walked into the Park Mansion and would not be satisfied with anything less than the full accounting. He asked about my childhood, where I was born, what school I attended. He asked these questions with the particular ease of someone who already knows the answers to some of them and is using the known answers to calibrate the accuracy of what I say about the things he does not yet know. I answered everything with the precise architecture of a woman who has been preparing for this conversation since before she arrived in Seoul. Not lies. I have never been good at lies, but curated truth, the shape of honesty without the full interior. He asked how I came to be a caterer. I told him about the years after our parents died, the practical necessity of making money from what I was good at, the careful building of something from very little. All of it true. All of it true in the way that a painting of a landscape is true, accurate in the shapes, but not standing in the weather. He listened with the patience of someone who is not listening for the content, but for the quality. He asked how I came to be at the party. I told him about Madame Adaeze, the referral, the work. I told him this carefully, walking the line between the version that would hold under scrutiny and the version that would not. He nodded slowly, and then he asked, "Do you love my son?" The question arrived differently than the others. Not casual, not the performance of casual, just direct. The real question asked directly for the first time. I looked at him. I said, "Yes." He held my gaze for a moment. He said, "And do you think he is doing the right thing?" I said, "I think your son has been doing the right thing since before anyone in this house recognized it as the right thing." Something shifted in his expression. Fractional. The assessment adjusting. He said, "You speak of him with more respect than most people in that house do." I said, "Most people in that house are measuring him against what they expected him to be. I'm only measuring him against what he actually is." The father was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me about your family." I told him about my parents. The way they died. Not the grief of it, just the facts of it. The way Emeka and I had held each other up afterward. The way we had built our small world from what remained after the larger one had been taken. And then I made the error. Not a large error. Not a stumble or a visible slip. Just one word that came out of my mouth attached to a sentence that should not have contained it. I said, "My brother and I always." And I stopped. The father's expression did not change. He continued as if he had not heard it. Asked another question about something else entirely. Moved the conversation forward in a direction that had nothing to do with what I had just said. But I felt it the way you feel a current change in water. The filing of the information. The particular quality of man who has just received something he was looking for and has decided that the most intelligent response is to appear not to have received it. I kept my breathing steady, kept my expression what it was, filed my own observation about his filing. We continued. He asked about her life in Lagos, about what she missed, about what had surprised her about Seoul. I answered all of it. And then he said, casually, in the same tone he had used for everything else, the tone of a man making conversation in a garden at night. "You mentioned a brother?" The word hit the center of my chest like something thrown with precision. Not because I had not known it was coming. I had known it was coming from the moment I made the error. I had been preparing for it from that moment. But preparation and arrival are different things. You can prepare for rain and still feel it when it comes. Emeka, the apartment in Lagos with his laptop open. The cloud system showing me what it should not have had to show. The flight to Seoul with a plan and a grief and a fury that I had been organizing into something useful, because the alternative was to let it become something that consumed me entirely. All of it arrived in the space between his question and my answer. Every muscle in my body held. The tears that were always there. The ones I had been managing since before I left Lagos, pressing against everything I had built to contain them. I looked at the garden, at the old trees, at the stone path, at the night sky above us. And then I looked at him, and I smiled. The specific smile of someone who has decided that this moment will not break the surface of what they are showing. I said, and my voice was steady, though it cost me more than anything in that garden, including the gun on the table between us. I said, "He is dead." The father went very still. The specific stillness of a man who has just received the last piece of something he has been assembling and feels the weight of the completed picture. He said, "I am sorry." And in the quality of those words, in the specific way he said them, I heard something I had not expected to hear. Not the performed sympathy of a powerful man managing a sensitive moment. Something more genuine than that. Something that carried the weight of a person who has just understood something about themselves that they did not know they were about to understand. He opened his mouth to ask the next question, and the first shot rang out. Time does a particular thing in moments of genuine violence. It is not slowed down the way it does in films, clean and cinematic and giving you space to be heroic. It compresses. Everything happening at once in a density that your mind cannot fully process until it is already over and you are on the other side of it trying to reconstruct what occurred in what order. What I know is this. I saw the figure in black at the far end of the garden before the second shot came. The specific quality of movement that does not belong to someone who is supposed to be there. The deliberate approach. The arm raised. I picked up the gun from the table. The father looked at me. The look between us lasted less than a second, but it contained everything. His assessment of whether I was going to use it on him and my acknowledgement of that assessment, and the answer I gave him with my eyes before my body moved. I said, "Bend down." Now. And I shot. The figure at the far end of the garden went down. And then the garden was no longer a garden. It was a battlefield. Figures in black coming over the walls from multiple directions. The sound of gunfire opening up from more than one location. The father's few trusted men materializing from the perimeter and moving toward the threat. The garden's careful peace destroyed completely in the span of seconds. I pulled the father down behind the stone table. He was not a man who was pulled anywhere. I knew this about him, but he allowed it. The specific allowance of a man who has assessed the situation and recognized that someone else's instincts in this moment are the correct instrument. We stayed low behind the stone table as the gunfire continued. I fired twice more, both shots finding targets. Not because I was trained for this specifically, but because Lagos had taught me things about survival that no formal training covers, and because at this range and in this light the calculation was not complicated. The father was beside me, his shoulder against mine, his breathing controlled in the way of someone who has been in dangerous situations before and has developed a working relationship with the specific quality of fear that they produce. One of his men fell. Another moved to cover us. I heard the traitor before I identified him. The specific direction of one of the gunshots that should not have come from that direction, given where his man had been standing. The angle was wrong. The position was wrong. I filed this. There would be time for what it meant later. The shooting that remained of his security managed to clear enough of the immediate threat to create a window, 30 seconds, maybe less, of reduced fire from the west garden wall. I grabbed the father's arm. I said, "We move now, toward the east wall, the car." He looked at me for a fraction of a second. Then he moved. We ran. The garden was not large, but in the dark with the sound of shots still coming from behind us, it felt like crossing a distance that had no fixed measurement. His men covering our movement, the remaining attackers regrouping, the east wall ahead of us getting closer. We went over the wall. The car was there. One of his men had positioned it correctly, the one small piece of good fortune in an evening that had contained very little of it. We got in. We drove. And I sat in the back of the moving car with a gun in my hand and the father of my husband beside me and the sound of my own breathing very loud in my ears. And I thought about Emeka, and I thought about the gun on the table, and I thought about the question he had been about to ask before the first shot came, and I thought about the particular quality of a look on the father's face in the moment I pulled him down behind the table. He had thought I was going to use that gun on him, and I had used it to save his life. I did not know yet what to do with that. The main hotel was 20 minutes from the private garden. When we arrived, J1 was already there. He was standing at the entrance with the contained, controlled stillness of a man who has received information that has cost him everything to receive and has organized that cost into something he can stand inside without it showing on the outside. Beside him were men, his men, the inner circle, assembled and present and ready. He had known, not in time to intercept, but in time to be here, in time to have the cars ready and the doctor on call and the path home secured. He saw us come through the entrance, his father and his wife, both still standing, both marked by the evening in ways that would be visible to anyone who knew what to look for. And something moved through his expression so quickly that I almost missed it. Almost. Relief. The specific quality of relief that only arrives after the kind of fear that does not announce itself in advance. He crossed to us. His eyes went to me first, the full damage assessment, the systematic check from my face to my hands to the rest of me, cataloging everything. Scratches. The bruising beginning on my left arm from where I had hit the stone path. The tension in how I was holding myself. His jaw tightened. Then he looked at his father. The two men looked at each other for a long moment. No words. The particular language of two men in a family that does not speak its most important things directly. Then the father put his hand briefly on his son's shoulder. And J1 exhaled. We went home. The family doctor came. A man of discreet professional precision who had been caring for the Park family for long enough that his presence in the mansion at unusual hours did not require explanation. He worked in the father's rooms first. The wound at his shoulder that had been grazed by a shot, the bruising from the fall behind the stone table. Then he came to me. I sat in the bedroom chair and let him work and said very little. Minji was beside me the entire time, not saying anything, not needing to, just present in the particular way she was always present, the loyal, attentive watchfulness of someone who has decided that being beside you is where they belong. J1 sat across the room. He did not look away from me for the duration of the doctor's examination. The expression on his face was the expression of someone who has decided that looking at something is the only way to confirm that it is real and present and has not been taken. When the doctor finished and left, J1 crossed the room and crouched in front of the chair where I was sitting and looked at my face from that lower position. The specific posture of a man who is making himself smaller in order to see something more clearly. He said, "The scratches." I said, "They are fine." He said, "The bruising on your arm." I said, "It will be gone in a week." He said, "And everything else." I knew what he meant by everything else. The thing that was not scratches and bruising. The word from the hospital that was still in the air between us, still new, still being accommodated. I said, "Everything else is fine." I made sure to fall carefully. Something moved in his expression. He said, "You made sure to fall carefully." I said, "I've been looking after myself for a long time. It becomes a habit." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he took my hand and pressed his lips briefly against the back of it. A gesture so quiet and so private that it existed only for us and the room and the night. And he stood up and went to the chair beside the bed and sat in it and did not leave. I watched him settle into the chair. I thought about the hospital this morning, the white room and the word in his hand taking mine. I thought about the car after and the things we had said that were true without being the entire truth. I thought about the garden and the gun and the father's face in the moment before the first shot came. I thought about all of it, and then I stopped thinking and I closed my eyes and let the night do what nights do. Minji stayed. J1 stayed. Nobody slept. In the father's wing of the mansion, the mother sat beside her husband's bed in the particular stillness of a woman who has spent decades beside a powerful and dangerous man and has learned to absorb the consequences of that proximity without losing her shape. Seo-yeon sat in the chair near the window. She had not spoken much since they brought her father home. She sat in the chair and looked at his sleeping face and carried the weight that she had been carrying since the night her best friend showed her true face and told her what she had actually been used for. The father she had helped in danger. The brother she had helped target. The woman she had spent months trying to remove who had used her own body as a shield between the attackers and the man lying in this bed. She sat in the chair and looked at her father and felt the specific quality of guilt that has no clean exit. The guilt of someone who cannot undo what they have done and cannot pretend they did not do it and cannot yet find the words for either. She sat there all night. Nobody slept. J1, left before the sun, made any promises. I know this because I heard him, the quiet movement of a man who has learned to move through spaces without disturbing them, who has been doing it his entire life in a house that required discretion as a matter of survival. The connecting door, his room, his corridor, the sound of the house receiving him as he moved through it, and then the specific quality of the silence that follows when someone has left the building. I lay in the dark and listened to that silence. Minji was asleep in the chair. Finally, the first sleep she had allowed herself in 2 days, and I did not wake her. I lay in the dark with my hand over my stomach. Not dramatically. Not with any of the weight of the gesture performed. Just my palm flat against the fabric of my nightgown over the place where something was beginning that had not been there before. I thought about Emika. I always thought about Emika. But this time the thought was different again. Different from the grief version and different from the hospital version. This time the thought arrived as a question. What would you say to me right now? I knew the answer. Emika had always had opinions about everything and had never been interested in keeping them private. He would have said something that made serious things sound slightly amused at themselves. He would have said something that made me laugh, and then made me cry, and then made me laugh again because he understood that grief and joy were not opposites and had never pretended otherwise. I pressed my eyes closed. I said to him in the private language of people who are no longer in the same world, but have not entirely stopped talking to each other. I'm going to find out the truth, whatever it costs. Then I opened my eyes and looked at the ceiling, and let the morning begin. Downstairs in the clan's formal meeting room, J1 stood at the head of the table with the full senior membership of the Park clan assembled around it. He had called this meeting at 5 in the morning. Nobody had questioned it. He laid out everything. The full picture as he understood it. The Shin Clan's drug operation and its exposure. The public reaction and the destruction of their manufacturing base. The retaliation, his father's attack, the traitor in their own security who had made it possible, the narrowness of the survival. He laid it out with the systematic precision of someone who has been building toward this moment for a long time and has organized every piece of it into a structure that could be delivered clearly and acted on immediately. The men around the table listened. When he finished, there was a silence that was not the silence of confusion or hesitation, but the silence of men absorbing a clear situation and preparing to respond to it. He said, "We are no longer preparing for war. We are in it. The question is not whether, but how, and when, and with what resources, and through what alliances. I have answers to all of these questions, and I'm going to share them with you now." And he did. When the clan meeting ended, he assembled the full security personnel of the Park household, every man and woman responsible for the physical protection of the family and its interests, and he spoke to them with the same directness and the same clarity. Then he identified the traitor, quietly, efficiently, with the cold authority of someone who has known for longer than the traitor realizes and has been waiting for the correct moment. The traitor was removed. Then Jaewon left the mansion with 4 of his most trusted men and drove to 3 separate locations across Seoul. Allies in the underground network, people who owed the Park clan debts of various kinds, people who would provide what was needed, weapons, men, intelligence support. He did all of this before the city had finished its breakfast. His father had spent 30 years believing his son was not capable of leading. His son had been leading all along. It was mid-morning when the father opened his eyes. The mother was beside him immediately, the instinctive movement of a woman who had been watching for this moment through the entire night. Seo-yeon rose from the window chair. The father lay still for a moment in the way of someone returning from a long distance. Then his eyes focused. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the window. He looked at his wife and at his daughter. And then he said a name. Not his wife's name. Not his son's name. Adaeze. The mother looked at the daughter. The daughter looked at the mother. The father turned his head toward them, and in his voice, still carrying the weakness of a man who had been through what he had been through, but underneath it carrying something that would not be weakened regardless of the circumstances, he said, "Give me Adaeze." Now, the mother stood. Seo-yeon stood, both of them moving with the specific urgency of people who had just heard something that reorganized the instructions they were operating under. Seo-yeon went. The mother stayed with her husband, and the father immediately said, "How is she? Is she hurt? How badly?" The mother said, "She has some bruising. Scratches. The doctor said she is." He said, "And the child?" The mother went very still. The father looked at her. He said, "My son told me this morning before he left. Before all of you woke up. He came to my room, and he sat beside me, and he told me." The mother sat down slowly in the chair beside the bed. The father looked at the ceiling. He said softly, "Get me Adaeze." In the East Wing, Minji had been awake since before Adaeze opened her eyes. The particular vigilance of a woman who has decided that sleeping is something other people do when there is nothing requiring her attention, and there was always something requiring her attention. When Adaeze woke, Minji was already there, tea on the table, the quiet, efficient presence of someone who had been waiting for this specific moment and had prepared for it. They sat together in the morning bedroom the way they sat together sometimes when the house was quiet enough for it. Not as employer and employee, but as 2 women who had been through enough together to have earned the particular ease of not needing to perform anything for each other. Adaeze asked first, "How is the father?" Minji said, "He slept through the night. The doctor came again at 6. The wound is clean. He will recover fully." Adaeze said, "And the men who came with us, the ones who were in the garden." Minji's expression shifted fractionally. She said, "2 did not make it back." Adaeze was quiet for a moment. She thought about the garden, about the specific quality of the darkness and the sound of the shots and the stone path under her feet as they ran toward the east wall. She said, "They were good men." Minji said yes. They sat in the quiet of the morning together with the weight of that. Then the door opened and Seo-yeon walked in. The two women looked at each other. In the doorway, Seo-yeon stood with the particular quality she had been carrying for days. The guilt and the fear and the pride all present simultaneously, the assembled composure costing everything it had ever cost. She looked at Adaeze on the bed, at the bruising on her arm visible above the blanket, at the scratches on her collarbone. She said, "My father's asking for you." Her voice was steady, but beneath the steadiness was something that had not been there before in any interaction between them. Something that had no name yet, but was in the vicinity of the place where respect is born before it knows itself as respect. Adaeze looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "How is he feeling?" Seo-yeon blinked. She said, He is asking for you. He seems." She stopped. She tried again. She said, "He called your name first." Well, he woke up. Before anything else. The two women looked at each other. And in the space between them, the space that had been defined entirely by hostility and jealousy and fear and catastrophic choices and their cascading consequences, something shifted. Not resolved, not healed, nothing so complete or so clean as that. Just shifted, like furniture that has been in the same position so long you forget it can be moved, and then someone moves it and the room suddenly has different light in it. Adaeze said, "Give me a moment." Seo-yeon nodded and stepped back into the corridor. Adaeze looked at Minji. Minji was already holding the robe. The father's bedroom was in the west wing, the mirror of the east wing in layout, but different in atmosphere. Heavier, the dark wood paneling more prominent, the furnishings more severe, the particular quality of a room that belongs to a man who has never been interested in comfort as an end in itself. He was propped against the pillows when Adaeze entered with Minji behind her and Seo-yeon behind Minji. The mother was in the chair beside the bed. The family doctor had been and gone. The room had the particular stillness of a space that has been holding its breath. The father's eyes found her the moment she came through the door. And Park Sung-jin, patriarch, clan leader, the man who had spent 30 years building one of the most powerful underground empires in South Korea, who had never been seen to express anything in public that he had not decided in advance to express. Park Sung-jin tried to get up. He pushed himself forward from the pillows. His jaw tightened with the effort. His shoulder, the wounded one, pulling against the movement. He got himself partially upright, one hand pressing into the mattress. Adaeze crossed the room quickly. She said, "Do not." He looked at her. She said, "Please, sit back." He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has spent his entire adult life being the person who decides what happens in any given room and is now in the position of being asked to not do something by a woman half his age who yesterday used a gun to keep him alive. He sat back, but he kept his eyes on her as she came to stand beside the bed. And there was something in those eyes, in the expression of the man who had placed a gun on a stone table to test whether she would use it on him and had watched her use it on his enemies instead. There was something that was not the calculating assessment he brought to everything. Something more like what you feel when you have been wrong about something important for a long time and have just understood the full scope of how wrong you were. He said, "Sit down." She sat in the chair across from the mother. He said, "Are you hurt?" She said, "Bruises, scratches, nothing that will not heal." He said, "The child." She looked at him. He said, "My son told me this morning. I am asking if the child is unhurt." She said, "The child is fine." He looked at her for a long moment with that expression she was still cataloging, the new one, the one that did not have a name yet. Then he said, "You picked up the gun." It was not a question. She said, "Yes." He said, "You knew I placed it there deliberately." She said, "Yes." He said, "And you picked it up anyway." She said, "You were about to be shot." The reason the gun was on the table was no longer the most relevant fact about the gun. The father was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I placed it there to see if you would use it on me." She said, "I know." He said, "And you used it to save my life." She said yes. He said why. The question hung in the room. The mother was completely still in her chair. Seoul behind Adaeze was completely still. Minji was completely still. Adaeze looked at the father. She said, because whatever reason I came here with, I have a different reason now. And the different reason was in that garden with me. The father looked at her for a very long time. Then the bedroom door opened and Jae-won walked in. He had come back from his morning's work with the particular quality of someone who has done what needed to be done and has arrived at the next thing that needs doing. He looked at the room, his father in the bed, his mother in the chair, his sister near the door, Minji against the wall, and his wife in the chair beside the bed. And he read the room the way he read every room completely and immediately. He came and stood at the center of it. He said, I need to tell you all something. All of you. Together. Now, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. He began. He told them about the Shin clan's drug operation. The full scope of it. Not the public version that had been exposed to the media, but the private version. The one his own investigation had uncovered over months of careful work with the people he trusted most. The specific composition of the drug. The deliberate suppression of the research that showed what it was doing to long-term users. The systematic elimination of everyone who came close enough to the truth to be a problem. He told them about the plan. The marriage proposal that had never been about peace or alliance. The positioning strategy, the Shin daughter inside the Park household. The Park clan destabilized from within. The gradual transfer of power and territory and influence. The pharmaceutical empire as the funding mechanism. The whole architecture of it. He told them about the forged signature, his father's name on a transaction document connected to a death that his father had nothing to do with, placed there deliberately, a prepared escape route in case the drug operation was ever fully exposed, redirect the investigation toward the Park patriarch, let the Parks absorb the consequences of something the Shins had done. He told them about the man whose death the signature was connected to, a chemist. A young man from Lagos who had come to Seoul for work, who had been hired by the Shin clan because of his expertise, who had not known who they really were when he accepted the work because they had been so careful for so long about what they showed to the outside world, who had discovered what the drugs were doing, who had tried to expose it, who had been killed for it, whose death had been arranged to look like something it was not, and whose name had been attached to a forged document designed to implicate the Park patriarch if the truth ever came looking for a door. His name was Emeka. He was 26 years old when he died in Seoul. He was Adaeze's brother. The room went completely silent. The kind of silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something so large that sound cannot exist alongside it. Adaeze had known this was coming. She had known from the moment Jae-won began, had felt the shape of it in the architecture of how he was building toward it, the sequence of what he was saying and what came next. She had been preparing for it in the particular way she prepared for everything, organizing the interior, reinforcing the structures, building the containment. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough, because the truth is different from the knowledge of the truth. You can know something completely and still be undone by its arrival in spoken words in a room full of people. The knowing and the hearing are not the same thing and have never been the same thing, and she had known this about herself and had prepared anyway, and it had not been enough. Emeka, his name in her husband's mouth in this room. His name spoken aloud by someone who knew the full story of what had happened to him and why and who had done it. His name finally, after all of it, after Lagos and Seoul and the party and the study and the corridors and the marriage and the garden and the hospital and everything, after all of it, being given back to her by the truth. She felt the tears before she decided to cry. The quiet kind, not the loud version, not wailing or collapsing or any of the dramatic vocabulary of grief. Just the quiet version. The tears that fall when something has been held so tightly for so long and the holding is finally over. She felt herself going. Not unconscious. Not the faint. She had done the faint and she was not doing it again. just the particular going of someone whose legs have decided that standing is no longer the appropriate response to what is happening. Minji was beside her before she reached the floor, both arms around her, the familiar hold, and then something she had not expected, something she had not prepared for because she had not known to prepare for it. On her left side, another pair of hands, smaller, softer, uncertain in the way of someone doing something they have never done before and are not entirely sure how to do, but are doing it anyway. Seo-yun, kneeling beside her, her hands on Adaeze's arm, her face, the face that had been composed and hostile and performing and guilty and afraid, carrying something entirely different now. The specific expression of someone who has just had their heart broken by a story that they did not know they needed to hear, and that has reached through everything they built between themselves and the person in front of them and found something underneath all of it. Compassion. On her other side, the mother's hand on her shoulder. Brief. Awkward. The gesture of a woman who does not know how to do this, but is doing it. Adaeze sat on the floor of the father's bedroom with Minji holding her and Seo-yun beside her and the mother's hand on her shoulder, and let the tears fall quietly for her brother. For Emeka, who was 26. For Emeka, who would have been an uncle. For Emeka, who had tried to do the right thing and had been killed for it, and whose death had been used as a weapon against people who had nothing to do with it. For Emeka, who she was going to make sure the world knew the full truth about. She cried for him quietly in the father's bedroom, with the people who had been her obstacles and her enemies holding her up. And on the other side of the room, Park Sung-jin, who had known some of this and had been carrying the specific weight of a man who understands that a crime was committed in his name without his knowledge, and that a woman came into his household carrying the consequences of that crime, wept, quietly, without performance. The tears of a man who has lived his entire life in the hard vocabulary of power and consequence, and has just been reminded that some things do not respond to that vocabulary. Jae-won watched his father weep, and in his father's face he saw something he had been waiting a very long time to see. Not the calculating patriarch, not the man who had spent 30 years finding him insufficient. Just a man, carrying something heavy, human in the way that people are human when the weight becomes too much for the performance to cover. The father looked at his son. He said, and his voice was not the voice of command, not the voice of authority, not the voice of the man who had assembled and directed and controlled everything for 30 years. Just a man's voice, rough with what he had been carrying and was now putting down. I am sorry, he said. I spent 30 years believing you were not ready, not capable, not the right shape for what this family required. I was measuring you against what I thought leadership looked like, and I was wrong about what leadership looks like, and I was wrong about you, and I'm sorry. Jae-won looked at his father for a long moment. Then he crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed beside him, and the two men sat together in the particular silence of fathers and sons who have wasted time and know it and are not going to waste anymore. The room held all of it, the grief and the truth and the apology and the compassion and the war that was still coming outside the walls, and the new thing growing inside the woman sitting on the floor being held by the people who had tried to remove her. Then Jae-won looked up. He looked at Adaeze first. The look between them lasted less than a second, but it contained the question and her answer and his acknowledgement of her answer and everything that did not need to be said because it already existed between them in the language they had built that did not require words. She gave him the smallest nod. He looked at the room. He said, "There's one more thing." The room waited. He said, "Adaeze is pregnant." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a room that has already absorbed more than it thought it could hold and has just discovered it was wrong about its own capacity. The mother looked at Adaeze. Seo-yun looked at Adaeze. Minji, who had known in the way of someone who files observations without naming them until they are ready to be named, looked at Adaeze with the expression of someone for whom a long-held private understanding has just been confirmed publicly. The father looked at his son, and then he looked at Adaeze. She was still on the floor. still held by Minji on one side and Seo-yun on the other. Her face still carrying the aftermath of the tears, not cleaned up, not managed back into the composed surface, just present in the way that real things are present when you stop trying to make them look like something else. The father looked at her for a long time, and then he extended his hand, not to shake, not as a formal gesture, just extended it toward her, across the space between his bed and the floor where she was sitting. An offering, a gesture that had no name in the vocabulary of the Park clan, that had no precedent in the 30 years of this family's architecture. Just a hand extended toward a woman who had come here to destroy his family and had saved his life instead. The room was completely still. Adaeze looked at his extended hand. She looked at his face. She thought about the garden, about the gun on the stone table, about the question he had been about to ask when the first shot came, about the weight of his shoulder against hers behind the stone table when the bullets were flying, about the specific quality of the look on his face in that moment when she pulled him down, the assessment, the question, the answer she had given him with her body rather than her words. She thought about Emeka. She thought about the truth that had just been spoken aloud in this room. The truth that the man whose hand was extended toward her had not killed her brother. That his name had been used as the weapon. That he had been a target of the same people who had taken Emeka. That the enemy she had been pointing at since Lagos was not the enemy she had been pointing at since Lagos. She thought about the child, about the word from the white hospital room this morning that was still organizing itself into the new shape of everything. She thought about J1, about the balcony and the dawn and the first real smile and the hand over hers on his chest and all of it, all the months of it, all the complicated, layered everything of it. She looked at the father's extended hand, and she took it, his hand around hers, old and strong and carrying everything his life had cost him. Her hand in his, caramel against the weathered lines of his palm. The room breathed. Outside the walls of the mansion, the war was coming. The Shin clan was regrouping and rearming and planning the next move in a conflict that had already cost both sides and would cost more before it was finished. The underground world was watching. The city was continuing. The future was arriving with all the indifference and momentum that futures bring. But in this room, in the father's bedroom in the west wing of the Park mansion with the morning light coming through the tall windows, something was beginning that had not existed before. Not peace, not resolution, not the clean ending of things. Something more honest than any of those. A family, imperfect, damaged, complicated, war-bound, carrying grief and guilt and truth and new life simultaneously, choosing to be a family. Adaeze held the father's hand.